Part 2 of this series was about criticisms of the Great Replacement idea by people who tried to downplay the extent of the demographic changes happening in Europe. Another group of people accepts the demographic reality of the Great Replacement. However, they welcome these changes as a means to increase the diversity of European societies. This video introduces the views of some typical representatives of this group and confronts these views with reality. Sadiq Khan, Mayor of London, said this during a press conference on the 29th of November, 2019. "I'm mayor of the greatest city in the world, and one of our strengths is our diversity." The occasion of the press conference highlights the bitter, unintended irony of Sadiq Khan's statement. It was the jihadist attack in London by Muslim terrorist Usman Khan, in the course of which he killed 2 people and injured 3. Sadiq Khan is fully aware that the diversity he is praising is the result of the replacement of the original English population of London by migrant communities from all over the world. People identifying as white British are now in the minority in the capital of Great Britain. In the 2011 Greater London Census, only about 45% of the population would identify as white British. The London mayor is, of course, not alone in Europe advertising the advantages of diversity. Consider the following 2 citations from leftist German politicians. The first of these is from the German Green Party politician Stefanie von Berg. She said this in November 2015, in the middle of the refugee crisis, when thousands of asylum seekers entered Germany every day. "Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, our society is about to change. Our city is going to change radically. And I believe that in 20 to 30 years we will have no more ethnic majorities in our city. And that's what migration researchers say. We'll live in a city where, simply said, our city lives on. We have many different ethnicities, many people, that we have a supercultural society. That is what we will have in the future. And I'll tell you quite clearly, especially in the direction of the right, that's a good thing." The second citation is also from a German Green Party politician, Katrin Göring-Eckardt, a leader of the German Green Party. She had this to say at the Congress of the Green Party in November 2015. "We talk about how our country will look like in 20 to 30 years. It will be younger. How great is this? We have been talking about demography for so long. It will become more diverse. How great is that? We have been looking forward to this for so long. Our country will change, and drastically. And I'm looking forward to it." Göring-Eckardt was referring to the expected changes caused by the mass migration wave of mid-2015. Both politicians clearly acknowledge the demographic reality of the Great Replacement, the radical and drastic changes happening in German society as a result of mass immigration. Von Berg expects that a German majority in Hamburg will disappear within a couple of decades, to be replaced by a multi-ethnic and multicultural society. Göring-Eckardt expects a younger, more diverse population. Both of them are looking forward to these radical changes and expect the resulting society to be a great place to live in. How do these people imagine the society that they envision will look like in practice? Luckily, we have a hint about that. Aydın Özgüç is a German social democratic politician with Turkish roots. She acted as the Commissioner for Immigration, Refugees and Integration in the German federal government in 2015, the year of the refugee crisis. Given the many issues that were appearing, the German government saw it necessary to create some general guidelines, a strategy about how to deal with those issues. One contribution to this strategy was a master plan put forward by Özgüç. The newspaper Die Welt described the conclusions of her master plan as follows. Özgüç's statements end with a clear message: we are facing a fundamental change. Our society will continue to be more diverse, which will also be exhausting and sometimes painful. Coexistence must be renegotiated every day. To be an immigration society means that not only the people who come to us have to integrate. Everyone has to get involved and accept the changes. The original population of Germany, which has welcomed the immigrants, can't expect a special status in this negotiation process. It can't assume that it can keep its traditional way of life. It will have to enter into daily negotiations with newly arrived foreigners about new rules of coexistence. And it is expected from it that it integrates itself into the new multicultural society. Later, in 2017, Ozzo Guts chaired a commission which produced a document called Miteinander in Vielfalt, in English Together in Diversity, a mission statement and agenda for the immigration society. This document states that diversity is a fact, and identities are changeable. According to the document, collective and individual identities are never static. So there is not one German identity that is valid for everyone. Rather, belonging to society can be acquired. It is important that in the event of a conflict, everyone involved has the opportunity to negotiate at high level with each other. In other words, there is not just one valid German national identity which should guide an immigrant towards integration into society. Everybody, including every immigrant, can have their own special German identity. None of these identities is more important or genuine than the others. This means that the original idea of integration of new immigrants into a society, has lost all meaning. Note, by the way, that Ozzo Guts, who in her mission statement changed the original meaning of integration almost into its opposite, was the German Federal Commissioner for Immigration, Refugees and Integration for 5 years, between 2013 and 2018. According to Ozzo Guts, for Germany immigration will mean that its native population will be obliged to negotiate its way of life with foreigners, who have just arrived in the country. Germans better forget the idea that they might have some homeowner rights in their own home country. Leftists, like Ozzo Guts, acknowledge that problems and dangers can be expected along the way to the multicultural society that they dream of. However, they apparently think that these problems will be relatively minor and can be overcome. In any case, the diversity that they hope to achieve is, according to them, worth risking these problems. We are not convinced of this. What follows is a list of the sources of tensions, conflicts and problems that plague multicultural societies created by mass immigration. These conflicts and tensions emerge within European indigenous populations, principally between leftist supporters of mass migration on the one hand and their opponents on the other hand. They also emerge between indigenous populations and immigrants, and also between immigrant groups. We'll show examples and other types of empirical evidence, for example scientific research, to document these conflict sources. We divide the sources of conflict into the following categories: cultural, ideological, political, psychological, human capital related, and crime related. For each of these categories we listed a number of factors which, we think, play a role in creating tensions and conflicts in society. In this video, we are going to focus on the 4 categories on the left-hand side. The last 2 categories, human capital and crime-related, will require separate treatment. Let's start with cultural sources of conflict. One result of mass immigration is the loss of cultural identity by the natives. A recent tweet by English comedian John Cleese, of the Life of Brian and Fawlty Towers fame, expresses this sentiment. He writes in the tweet, "Some years ago I opined that London was not really an English city anymore. Since then, virtually all my friends from abroad confirmed my observation." John Cleese is, of course, not alone in feeling a loss of identity like this. An article from 2017 in the online journal Dutch News describes the research project Becoming a Minority, or BAM, conducted by the Free University in Amsterdam. The project is based on the observation that native Europeans are now the minority, or are close to becoming the minority, in a number of big cities in Europe. The project's leaders expect that this will be more common in the future. The article writes, instead of being in the majority in large Dutch cities, the native Dutch have become a minority, according to Maurice Krul of Amsterdam's VU University. Krul has been investigating migration and integration for 25 years and has just begun a major new study this year, not of migrant groups but of the white ethnic Dutch. It's already happening in Amsterdam. Only 1 in 3 youngsters under the age of 15 is of Dutch parentage, Krul told. With a team of 8 researchers, Krul is starting a unique 5-year study of 6 large European cities, including Amsterdam and Rotterdam. Frankfurt, Antwerp, Malmö and Vienna will also come under the spotlight. If you want to look at integration, you need to look at the ethnic white Dutch, he said. Who adapts to who if there is no majority, he said. The project's website indicates that replacement of Europeans as the majority population is accepted as a fact, without any discussion. The aim of the project is simply to research the consequences of this fact and give advice to politicians about solutions to the resulting problems. The article about the BAM project has the comment section disabled, with a justification. Unfortunately, we have had to suspend comments on this article due to the volume of replies which break our guidelines. It seems that too many people wrote angry comments under the article, upset by the idea that now the Dutch should change their identity in their own cities in order to integrate into the new multicultural Netherlands. One symptom of identity loss is giving up traditional symbols of identity. One example for this is what happened in the English town of Radstock, where, in 2013, the local council voted not to fly St. George's flag, the flag of England. The reason? A complaint by Eleanor Jackson, a university lecturer and town councillor belonging to the Labour Party, who said the red cross on white background could cause upset in Radstock because it was used during the Crusades 1,000 years ago. They voiced her concerns at a meeting called to discuss which flag should be purchased to fly atop the town's repaired civic flagpole. She said, "My big problem is that it is offensive to some Muslims, but even more so that it has been hijacked by the far right. No matter that even the local Muslim community deemed this complaint as oversensitive, and that Rizwan Ahmed, spokesman for the Bristol Muslim Cultural Society, said, I think they are going a bit far here. It is political correctness going a bit too far. This kind of over-eagerness to be compliant is quite typical of the mindset of current-day leftists, who would happily give up almost any symbol of national identity in order to appease minority communities. In this particular case there were some further developments. A protest action emerged, and people started to demonstrate in Radstock against the council's decision. At one point this apparently became too much for the council, and they withdrew their decision about not flying St. George's flag. Such backtracking didn't seem to happen in the English city of Bristol when in 2016 the City Council decided not to officially commemorate St. George's Day, a national day in England. As the British newspaper The Express Report 6 said, they didn't host a single event for this day, because the city was too multicultural. Council chiefs said 91 different languages are spoken in the town and it would be very difficult to commemorate them all. Thus, English traditions don't enjoy any kind of priority in this new multicultural society, no matter the fact that this is an English city, and that those traditions might be many hundreds of years old. The English and their traditions are only one part of this multicultural mosaic, not more. The resentment probably felt by many English citizens about this is well expressed by a tweet of the user Brooking1980, who wrote, Bristol City Council refused to acknowledge St. George's Day yesterday for fear of upsetting other faiths. They don't mind upsetting us. One argument often used in defense of diversity and multiculturalism is that it results in a large variety of international cuisine and restaurants, like these. That is true, but this diversity becomes a not-so-positive thing when some of these foods are forced down the throats of the indigenous population. This is particularly problematic for many if the food is obtained in a manner which is repulsive for many native Europeans. We are, of course, talking about Islamic halal food. Halal means allowed in Arabic. It refers to practices which are allowed according to Islam. With regard to diet, this means that only particular foods are allowed. For example, pork is not allowed. Also, animals must be slaughtered according to some rules. The throat of the animal should be cut, while the animal is still alive. At the pressure of animal rights organizations, some kind of stunning is now allowed, but it must be made sure that the animal is not killed by the stunning. However, some Muslim organizations oppose this policy and insist on non-stun slaughter. For these reasons, halal meat is a controversial subject in Europe, and this controversy grew with the increase in the Muslim populations in European countries. In 2015, the pork-free option at school cafeterias in a small French town was scrapped by the mayor, in the name of secularism. The issue was taken to the court, which in 2017 ruled that halal meals must be made available for school lunch. In the UK, many schools and universities offer the halal meat option. The problem is, as described in this article in the English Daily Express, in many school cafeterias, apparently all meat is halal. It is served to Muslim and non-Muslim children alike, without the knowledge of the parents of the non-Muslim children. Furthermore, as confirmed by Lancashire County Council, in many cases the meat stems from animals which haven't been stunned before slaughtered. This is repulsive to many people in the UK. Luckily, as the County Council reassures us, if children refuse to eat the non-stunned halal meat, they have a vegetarian choice, too. The next phase in this halal meat controversy is that the demand is made openly to serve halal meat only, as happened at Leicester University where students convinced the university cafeteria to do so. Similar demands are made in other parts of Europe as well, for example in Germany, in the town of Bilstedt, where in 2018 the chairman of the Parents' Council at a school made the demand that the school canteen should offer only halal meat. Loss of cultural identity has long been recognized as a problem and even as a mental health hazard. For example, an article in the journal World Psychiatry writes that the loss of one's social structure and culture can cause a grief reaction. If the symptoms cause significant distress or impairment and last for a specified period of time, psychiatric intervention may be warranted. Such problems are acknowledged and are treated with understanding and sympathy when they affect non-European migrants who arrive in a new cultural environment, or indigenous non-European people living in a Western country, for example Aborigines living in Australia. Even a diagnostic term, cultural bereavement, is coined for describing the psychological problems that might appear as a result of the loss of cultural identity. In contrast, complaints about the loss of identity for indigenous European populations, as a result of the continued growth of immigrant populations among their midst, have typically been met with ridicule and scathing criticism. People who voice such concerns are routinely labeled as xenophobe, far-right, racist and Nazi. One example is the reaction to John Cleese's tweet, mentioned before. This short tweet, containing the mildly formulated complaint that London was not really an English city anymore, was attacked viciously, called racist and ridiculed by many famous and less famous people. One result of the growth of the Muslim population in Europe is that Muslim architectural symbols become more and more visible in Europe's cities. For example, there are now probably about 1,750 mosques in the UK, 2,300 in France and more than 3,000 in Germany. One of the biggest and newest mosques is the Central Mosque of Cologne, built in 2017. There has been some concern, even from representatives of the nowadays very multiculturally minded Catholic Church, that the mosque might change the appearance and the skyline of Cologne too much. The picture shows that these concerns were not unjustified. The Central Mosque is in the foreground, with the Cologne Cathedral in the background. One pronounced feature of mosques are the minarets, the towers from where the muezzin traditionally calls the believers to prayer. These minarets have been of particular concern in some places in Europe. In 2009, the Swiss population voted in a referendum against the construction of new minarets. 4 already existing minarets have not been affected. One of them, at Vongen in Olten, is shown here. The call to prayer by loudspeaker can now be heard in several places in Europe. Of course, it is heard by Muslims and non-Muslims alike, who live in the neighborhood of the mosque. Some non-Muslims complain about this. For example, in the German town Oerkenschwick, a Christian couple has successfully halted a local mosque's weekly call to prayer. In 2018, a German court ordered the mosque to stop broadcasting its weekly call to prayer. The town Oerkenschwick, however, wants to allow the Muslim call to prayer. It appealed this decision by the court. Apparently the appeal process is still ongoing and there is no decision yet in this case. In a similar case in 2018 in Sweden, the town Vaxio allowed the Muslim call to prayer, in spite of a heated debate about it. This decision was particularly galling for some non-Muslims, because 2 previous requests by the Catholic community to allow the ringing of church bells was rejected by the town. Differences between European and Muslim customs and habits are felt in many other ways, too. An often discussed influence of Muslim customs is the proliferation of hijab-wearing women in the streets of European cities. The hijab is a head covering worn by many Muslim women. While the hijab leaves the face visible, the niqab covers the whole face, except the eyes. The even more extreme burqa covers the whole face, including the eyes. The woman wearing it looks at the world from behind a lattice. The niqab and the burqa are seen by many in Europe as particularly offensive pieces of clothing, severely limiting the freedom of women wearing it. They are recognized as a symbol of oppression of women, and also as a security risk. During the last 10 years, countries like Austria, France, the Netherlands, Denmark, Norway and Belgium have enacted laws banning the wearing of the burqa and the niqab in public. France, in addition, also forbids the hijab in public schools, and, since 2016, the burkini, a full-body swimsuit. There were demonstrations against these bans in Europe. They were attended by Muslim women, but often also by young European, non-Muslim, activists. The females among these Europeans would probably never consider wearing a burqa or niqab, except as a sign of solidarity with Muslims. Nonetheless, they stand behind the multicultural principle of tolerance for Muslim cultural practices, no matter how bad those practices are. Culture is interwoven with religion and ideology. Thus, many conflicts of a cultural kind have their basis in religion and ideology, in particular in conflicting values. European and Islamic values are often contradictory. One reason for this is that, while in Europe since the 17th century the process of enlightenment resulted in a more and more secular society, such an enlightenment never took place in Islam. In addition, Europe's values are deeply influenced by Christianity and, in particular, by the teachings and example of Jesus Christ. In contrast, Islamic values are deeply influenced by the teachings and the example of the Prophet Muhammad, who is, though not having a divine status in Islam, revered as the best example for mankind. Jesus and Muhammad were very different persons. Jesus was mild and peaceful, even extremely so. Muhammad, in contrast, was a warlord who led dozens of raids and military campaigns. Jesus was an ascetic. Muhammad was apparently extremely charged sexually. Jesus forgave those who accused and crucified him. Muhammad, in contrast, punished those who revolted or conspired against his rule. For example, beheading all the men of the Jewish tribe of the Banu Qurayza and enslaving their women and children. Here is a list of some of the most important conflicting values. While in Europe there is a separation of church and state, there is no such separation in Islam. In European democracies, laws are made by people. In Islam, the laws come from God. In Europe, adults are equal before the law. In Islam, women and men are not equal. For example, women receive half the inheritance that men receive, and their testimony at court is worth half the of that of a man. In Europe, freedom of speech is an important value, while in Islam no speech is free which insults the Prophet Muhammad or Islam. In Europe, science and reason trump faith, while in Islam faith is more important. And, as already mentioned, European values are influenced by the example of Jesus, while Islamic values are influenced by the example of Muhammad. These differences seem unbridgeable and often develop into religious hatreds. Islamic hate preachers in European countries use the democratic freedoms of these countries to openly propagate their hatred towards democracy and Christianity, and their intention to take over as soon as they are strong enough to do so. Such brazen attacks against their culture and traditions make many Europeans extremely angry, resulting in anti-Islam feelings among European populations, and the growth of anti-Islam movements like the EDL in the UK and Pegida in Germany. Chatham House conducted a poll of 10,000 people from 10 European countries about their attitudes to further Muslim immigration. The article describing the poll's results on Chatham House's website calls these results striking and sobering. On average, 55% agreed that all further Muslim immigration should be stopped. 20% disagreed, and 25% were undecided. The chart shows the results for the 10 countries. Many of the immigrants to Europe come from Muslim countries where anti-Semitism is rampant. This doesn't seem to bother many on the left, for whom the so-called Islamophobia seems a far more acute problem. Thus, it was no surprise when in 2004, the then Mayor of London, the Labour politician Ken Livingstone, welcomed Yusuf al-Qaradawi, giving him a red carpet treatment. Qaradawi is a well-known Muslim theologian, with connections to the Muslim Brotherhood. He has his own program on the TV station Al Jazeera, called Sharia and Life. The program is extremely popular in the Muslim world, with an estimated audience of 40 to 60 million worldwide. In January 2008, Qaradawi said this on Al Jazeera TV. Throughout history, Allah has imposed upon the Jews people who would punish them for their corruption. The last punishment was carried out by Hitler. This was divine punishment for them. Allah willing, the next time it will be at the hand of the believers. Thus, Qaradawi not only sees the Holocaust as a just punishment by Allah for the corruption of the Jews, carried out by Hitler. He also expresses the hope that the Jews will receive another similar punishment, this time carried out by Muslims. No wonder that violent anti-Semitism has seen a comeback in Europe in recent years. The picture here is from a video, filmed in Germany in April 2018. Two Israeli boys, wearing kippahs, were attacked by a Syrian refugee who used a belt to beat one of them. In schools in Germany, often with a high proportion of Muslim students, calling somebody "you Jew" is now a curse word. In 2018, at a Berlin primary school, a second-grader Jewish girl was cursed by a Muslim classmate as a Jew. He is said to have threatened to kill her because she does not believe in Allah. Jews are leaving Malmö, Sweden, because of the threat of violence from the large Muslim community in that city. Violence against Jews from the extreme right has also increased, as Jews are blamed by many for the multiculturalism and mass immigration, threatening European identity. In October 2019, in Halle, Germany, a German far-right extremist attacked a synagogue with a self-made weapon. After he didn't manage to enter the building, he shot a woman on the street and a man in a kebab shop. The divide between the left and right in politics is growing. Most of the violence seems to be coming from the militant far left, the Antifa, who are determined to fight Nazis with any means they deem necessary, and who are Nazis according to them. Basically anybody who is against mass immigration and multiculturalism. Thus, it is no wonder that members of the party AfD, or Alternative for Germany in English, the only party in the German parliament which takes a stand against mass immigration, are regularly denounced as Nazis by the Antifa and by the far left in general. The AfD is also the only party in the German parliament taking stand against BDS, an anti-Israeli movement aimed at boycotting Israeli products and stopping investment in the country. But this doesn't influence their designation of the AfD as Nazis. The Antifa regularly attacks AfD offices, street stands, and it often burns the cars of AfD members. In January 2019, Frank Magnitz, a member of the German federal parliament for the AfD, was violently attacked by 3 people, presumably from the Antifa. Some established political parties are more or less openly in alliance with the violent Antifa. The picture shows 2 of the leaders of the German Green Party, Cem Özdemir on the far left and Katrin Göring-Eckardt, third from the left, at an Antifa meeting. Both politicians are members of the German federal parliament. We have already encountered Göring-Eckardt at the beginning of this video, enthusiastically welcoming the drastic changes mass immigration was about to bring for Germany. This picture also shows a Green Party politician, speaking at the German federal parliament, upholding an Antifa flag. Though currently by far most of the violence seems to be coming from the far left, the issue of mass immigration also radicalizes the far right. Walter Lübcke, from Angela Merkel's party, the CDU, gave a speech in 2015, where he said that those Germans who didn't share his pro-migration values were welcome to leave the country. This caused lots of indignation among his audience and resulted in death threats later. These threats were carried out in June 2019, when a German far-right extremist shot Lübcke in the head. Ideology and politics are often interwoven in weird ways. One example is the relationship of leftist parties to voters of migrant background. Based on their traditional ideology of supporting the struggle of working-class people, it seems problematic for them to now support mass migration. This is because working-class people are the ones most affected by the influx of large numbers of immigrants, many of them from third-world countries. The cheap labor these migrants provide decreases wages. Prices for accommodation rises because of increased demand. Migrants also put additional pressure on national health services, making waiting queues longer for the poorer sections of the indigenous population, the main users of these services. The children of working-class people, using public schools, suffer from often large proportions of migrant children in their classes. All this becomes less important for leftist parties, if they can make sure that the immigrants coming into the country in large numbers vote for them. The British Labour Party, for example, has acquired the support of a large proportion of BAME, Black, Asian, minority, ethnic voters. One way the Labour Party achieved this was by supporting multicultural policies, defending migrants if their cultural practices were under attack. For example, in 2019, it tried to make a new, broadened definition of Islamophobia official, which describes this as a type of racism. This new definition of this phobia has not, until now, been accepted by the government, but it had the support also of the Liberal Democrats and even of the Scottish Conservative Party. How far this appeasement of the migrant population can go was shown by Labour Party officials in several so-called grooming scandals, the systematic sexual abuse of young English girls by mostly Muslim men. The first inquiry, reporting about child sexual exploitation in Rotherham, was commissioned in 2014. It estimates that more than 1,400 children were sexually abused between 1997 and 2013. During this whole period, the Rotherham Council was in the hands of the British Labour Party. The inquiry condemns the behaviour of these officials. Denial of the issue, little interest in dealing with the problem, and little support for those who were trying to investigate and stop the abuse were prevalent. The inquiry mentions that the ethnicity of the perpetrators was played down, so as not to damage community cohesion. A similar pattern has been observed in a number of similar scandals, in Oxford, Halifax, Rochdale, and Manchester. The perpetrators were almost always Muslim men. In 2017, German authorities launched an investigation into the activities of imams working at the newly built Cologne Central Mosque. These imams belong to the so-called DTIB Association, which is supported by Turkey. They are schooled in Turkey and are civil servants of the Turkish state. Other people working in the Cologne complex were investigated as well and were suspected of spying against Turks living in Germany on behalf of the Turkish government. The type of influence Turkey tries to have on Turks living in Germany was shown during a visit by the then Turkish Minister-President, and current President, Erdogan, in Cologne in 2008. He was received by 20,000 Turks like a pop star. His message was, Turks should stop assimilating in Germany. It's not difficult to imagine the long-term effect of a message like this on the Turkish minority living in Germany, with an already low levels of success of integration into German society. One can also easily grasp how such a message damages relations between such minority communities on the one hand and German society on the other hand. The many grievances that ethnic and cultural minorities often nurture against the majority society are another source of tensions and conflicts. In Britain, some people belonging to these minorities feel outright hatred against the country, like, for example, Dr. K. Andrews, a professor of Black Studies at Birmingham City University in England. Dr. Andrews, who is of African Caribbean heritage, is very explicit in his hatred of the English flag. He sees it as a symbol of colonialism, slavery and racism. One can easily imagine the ideas and values this professor teaches to his students. Another example is the controversy about the statue of Cecil Rhodes from Oriel College in Oxford. Rhodes was a 19th century British politician and businessman, who was a Prime Minister in Britain's Cape Colony in South Africa, and an outspoken British colonialist and imperialist. Rhodes funded the Rhodes Scholarships in 1902, which have supported many students over the years. Women were originally excluded from his scholarship. However, no race was excluded, and the first black student, from the United States, received the scholarship already in 1907. Since then, many other non-whites, and later also many women, were supported by Rhodes Scholarships. None of this mattered for the students who demanded the removal of the statue of Rhodes. A similar campaign, at the University of Cape Town in South Africa, led to the removal of a statue of Rhodes. Until now, Oxford University has shown more steadfastness, and refused the demand of these campaigners. The year 2020 saw a huge campaign, rioting, and mob action by Antifa and Black Lives Matter activists to remove many other statues and monuments. It doesn't matter for these people what significance a historical person had for the country. If they find anything in the past of a historical figure that can be construed as racist, the statue of that person has to be removed. Thus, they defaced the statue of Winston Churchill, whose role as Prime Minister in World War II, defending Britain from Nazi Germany, cannot be overestimated. They demanded the removal of his statue. In this they haven't yet succeeded, though Churchill's statue is now covered by a box, in order to save it from further damage. The next type of conflict in ethnically and culturally diverse societies is of psychological and psychobiological origin. We'll mention here two such sources of conflict. One of these conflict sources is ethnocentrism. Hammond and Axelrod, two researchers from the University of Michigan, describe in an article ethnocentrism like this. Ethnocentrism is a nearly universal syndrome of discriminatory attitudes and behaviors. The attitudes include seeing one's own group, the in-group, as virtuous and superior, one's own standards of value as universal, and out-groups as contemptible and inferior. Behaviors associated with ethnocentrism include cooperative relations within the group, and the absence of cooperative relations without groups. Ethnocentric behaviors are based on group boundaries that are typically defined by one or more observable characteristics, such as language, accent, physical features, or religion, regarded as indicating common descent. Edward Dutton, in his book Race Differences in Ethnocentrism, identifies two types of ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism comes in two forms. On the one hand, positive ethnocentrism involves taking pride in your ethnic group or nation, and being prepared to make sacrifices for the good of it. Soldiers who regard their nation as being the best in the world, and are prepared to risk their lives to defend it, are positively ethnocentric. On the other hand, negative ethnocentrism refers to being prejudiced against and hostile to members of other ethnic groups. One can easily imagine how such attitudes can cause conflicts between different ethnic groups, in particular if those groups live in close proximity to each other. Ethnocentrism appears to be deeply embedded in human nature. In-group preference appears from a very early age on. Consider the research done by Professor Paul Bloom from Yale University. In experiments with babies as young as 3 months, he found that these babies showed in-group preferences. In a New York Times article, Professor Bloom writes, "Our initial moral sense appears to be biased toward our own kind. There's plenty of research showing that babies have within-group preferences. 3-month-olds prefer the faces of the race that is most familiar to them to those of other races. And studies with young children have found that once they are segregated into different groups, even under the most arbitrary of schemes, like wearing different colored t-shirts, they eagerly favor their own groups in their attitudes and their actions. These attitudes are common among our nearest biological relatives among the great apes, chimpanzees. Chimpanzees often cooperate with members of their own group and show even altruistic behaviors towards them. On the other hand, they can be extremely brutal towards members of other groups, and often kill them if they encounter them in the wild. There have been some suggestions that this aggressive behavior towards members of other groups is caused by human intervention, for example habitat loss as a result, or by researchers who gave out food for chimpanzees, in order to be better able to observe them. This indeed caused aggression among the chimpanzees fighting for this free food. However, recent research described in an article in the science journal Nature shows that this is not a necessary condition of deadly aggression among chimpanzees. Chimpanzees are very well able to show brutality against each other without such human intervention, in particular against members of other chimpanzee groups. The researchers recorded 152 killings by chimpanzees and 1 by bonobos. The majority of the killings, 66%, was against members of other groups. They also estimated human impacts in the areas where the killings took place. They found that the rate of the killings was not related to the amount of human impact. All this supports the idea that this kind of deadly aggression among chimpanzees against members of other groups has an evolutionary origin, and thus, a genetic component. It is obvious that in-group versus out-group distinctions and ethnocentrism can be a powerful source of conflicts in society. What are such distinctions caused by? What makes people, and animals, prefer their own ethnicity or group? What makes them cooperate with members of their own group and be aggressive towards members of other groups? There are many theories about this, but essentially, two main ideas. One of these emphasizes the social origin of these phenomena and denies or minimizes a role for genetic factors. This is the social constructivist view. It denies the biological reality of ethnicity and race and insists that ethnic groups are essentially arbitrary. People form groups based on any arbitrary distinctions, of which skin color and other ethnic criteria are just a few of many. These ethnic groupings have no special importance, as compared to, for example, groups based on social class, religion or ideology. How do people acquire an attachment to an ethnic group? By learning and indoctrination, that is, the same way as acquiring attachment to any other group. What is the recipe for solving tensions between ethnic groups in society? Education. This means, among other things, educating people about how bad racism is. It also means that, if they are white, they should acknowledge their own racism and their privileged status. So-called hate speech and derogatory words used for some ethnic groups are both socially ostracized and in some European countries even punished by law. There are also many other attempts to suppress racism in social media. In many social science departments at universities, in much of the media and in leftist politics, the social constructivist view of race and ethnicity is currently the mainstream one. One example is this article from a law professor which appeared in the New York Times. Another example is this description of a sociology class at the University of Florida. The other main idea about the origin of ethnocentrism and ethnic conflict is that it has a genetic basis. According to this idea, ethnic groups and races are not just social constructs, existing only in the heads of people, as one of many arbitrary categories. Differences between ethnic groups are real. They have a genetic basis, resulting from evolutionary processes. These differences are the cause for ethnocentrism. This idea received scientific foundation with William D. Hamilton's work on kin selection and so-called inclusive fitness during the 1960s. Both of these terms mean that, during evolution, an individual animal can increase the chances of the survival of its genes, not just by making sure that the animal and its immediate descendants survive, but also by helping other members of its species to survive. This is because those other members share genes with the animal. Hamilton's work was a breakthrough in evolutionary biology because it explained a long-standing puzzle in that discipline: why do animals help each other? Why are they altruistic towards each other, even at the cost of endangering themselves or even sacrificing their own life? Hamilton stated that altruistic behavior by an animal towards another is a function of the genetic similarity of the two animals. The greater the similarity between two animals, the greater the probability of altruism between them. While Hamilton was mainly talking about altruism among animals towards more or less distant relatives, J. Philippe Rushton, a Canadian evolutionary psychologist, applied and broadened kin selection theory to any degree of genetic relatedness in humans, calling this set of ideas genetic similarity theory. These ideas provide an explanation for ethnocentrism. People prefer their own kind, their own tribe, nation, ethnicity or race, because they have more genes in common with these groups than with other tribes, nations, ethnicities or races. So which of these two competing theories about the basis of ethnocentrism is correct? Social construct theory or some version of genetic similarity theory? There is evidence for both. It is clear that people can join arbitrary groups and can feel passionate attachment to them. But ethnic groups are not just any arbitrary groups. Social construct theory is wrong in saying that there is no basis for ethnicity and race in biology, outside of there being social constructs. Though there are many overlaps and admixtures between races and ethnicities, there are identifiable clusters among them, which more or less correspond to traditional conceptions of races. Also, there is lots of evidence that genetic similarity plays a role in social choices of both animals and humans. Thus, though ethnocentrism might be partly a result of social learning, it very probably has a genetic basis, too. Consequently, ethnic conflicts within a country can't be easily eradicated by re-education or similar measures. Their genetic roots will not disappear by such measures. There seem to be only two ways to solve such conflicts. One of them is creating new, mixed races or ethnicities out of the original ethnicities. This would, in effect, erase the genetic differences between ethnicities and thus the genetic basis for ethnocentrism. The other way would be the separation of ethnicities into different countries or at least different, largely self-governing, areas. Of course, ethnic conflicts, like other kinds of conflicts in society, can be suppressed by authoritarian regimes. But this only forces them underground, and they are likely to reappear with renewed strength after the demise of the authoritarian regime, as shown by the example of Yugoslavia after the disappearance of Tito's communist regime. Tatu Vanhanen, a social science researcher from the University of Helsinki in Finland, did an investigation of ethnic conflicts in 176 countries. He compared the ethnic diversity, or ethnic heterogeneity, as he called it, of the countries with the number of ethnic conflicts in those countries. His results showed that in ethnically divided societies people tend to align themselves in conflict situations with their ethnic relatives more easily than with outsiders. The more a population is ethnically divided, the more such struggles tend to take place along ethnic lines. In other words, the more the genetic distance between competing ethnic groups grows, the more conflict tends to take place along ethnic lines. Vanhanen also tested the effect of 10 other variables on ethnic conflicts, for example per capita national income, the Human Development Index and the Democratization Index. He found that, though these variables did have an effect, this was smaller than the effect of ethnic diversity. In other words, the correlation between ethnic diversity and ethnic conflict was high, more than 0.8. This was higher than all the other correlations, for example between national income and ethnic conflict, Human Development Index and ethnic conflict, and so on. One indication of tension or conflict between different communities in a society is the level of trust between them. In 2001, political scientist Robert D. Putnam did a large-scale research investigating societal trust in communities in the USA. He published his research in 2007 in an article in the journal Scandinavian Political Studies. The research included 30,000 subjects, living in 41 communities. They were asked how much they trusted other races, their neighbors, who normally were of the same race as themselves, and their own race. The 41 communities differed from each other greatly with regard to ethnic diversity. Putnam writes in his 2007 paper, they were ranging from large metropolitan areas like Los Angeles, Chicago, Houston and Boston to small towns and rural areas like Yakima, Washington, rural South Dakota and the Kanawha Valley in the mountains of West Virginia. Los Angeles and San Francisco, roughly 30 to 40% white, are among the most ethnically diverse human habitations in history, whereas in our rural South Dakota County, 95% white, celebrating diversity means inviting a few Norwegians to the annual Swedish picnic. What were the expectations about this research? There are two opposite ideas about the effect of diversity on trust. Putnam writes, "In the theoretical toolkit of social science we find two diametrically opposed perspectives on the effects of diversity on social connections. The first, usually labeled the contact hypothesis, argues that diversity fosters interethnic tolerance and social solidarity. As we have more contact with people who are unlike us, we overcome our initial hesitation and ignorance and come to trust them more. I think it is fair to say that most, though not all, empirical studies have tended instead to support the so-called conflict theory, which suggests that diversity fosters out-group distrust and in-group solidarity. So which of these two ideas about the effects of diversity, the contact hypothesis or conflict theory, was supported by Putnam's research?" The results provided strong support for the conflict theory. Higher ethnic homogeneity, that is, less diversity, resulted in higher trust. Or, in other words, the more ethnically diverse a community was, the less trust was there between members of the community. The first chart shows trust towards other races, as a function of ethnic homogeneity. The lower the homogeneity, that is, the higher the diversity, the lower was the trust to other races. The second chart shows a similar relationship between diversity and trust to neighbors. The higher the diversity, the less that trust is. The third chart shows that, remarkably, trust to one's own race also decreased with higher ethnic diversity. In other words, higher ethnic diversity resulted in lowered trust across the board, toward everybody in the community. Putnam predicts that ethnic diversity will increase substantially in virtually all modern societies over the next several decades, in part because of immigration. This increased immigration and diversity, he writes, are not only inevitable, but over the long run they are also desirable. But he acknowledges that his own research supports conflict theory, at least for the short to medium run. In the short to medium run, immigration and ethnic diversity challenge social solidarity and inhibit social capital. He then expresses the hope that in the medium to long run, successful immigrant societies create new forms of social solidarity and dampen the negative effects of diversity by constructing new, more encompassing identities. He was obviously hoping to find evidence for this more hopeful view, and maybe this was the reason that he has not published his results for 7 years after they became available, and that even then it was in a relatively obscure Scandinavian journal. Putnam's results caused a surge in research on the relationship between ethnic diversity and trust. Alas, the results of this research effort during the last 13 years since Putnam's publication of his results do not justify his optimism about the positive mid to long-term effects of diversity, although, of course, this depends on what one means by mid and long-term. Though there have been many contradictory findings, there seems to be a consensus that most research shows a negative effect of diversity on interpersonal trust. Here are a few recent examples from academic articles in social science journals and conference presentations. All of them were published after Putnam's publication of his results in 2007. Belgian researcher Huger and his co-workers write in 2009. Several empirical studies have documented a negative relation between ethnic diversity and generalized trust, an attitude that is considered an important measure of social cohesion. Levels of generalized trust are not just lower among ethnic minorities themselves, but they are also suppressed among majority populations when they face diverse surroundings. Danish researchers Dinesen and Sunderskov write this in 2015. The past decade has seen a surge in within-country studies scrutinizing the relationship between trust and residential ethnic diversity. The results vary but generally point toward a moderate negative, although sometimes statistically insignificant, relationship. Dutch researchers Bogelsdijk and Klaasing state in 2013 that a lack of trust and higher prevalence of civil wars are all outcomes that prior literature has associated with high diversity within societies. British researchers Sturgis and co-workers write in 2014 that there is an increasingly consensual view within academic and policy circles that ethnically diverse communities are characterized by distrust, low levels of social cohesion and disputes regarding the equitable provision of public goods. Not all research evidence supports the notion that higher ethnic diversity leads to decrease of trust. In fact, Sturgis and his co-workers argue that much of the research which supports the idea that diversity leads to decreased trust haven't actually measured the amount of interaction between members of the different communities. They write, in ethnically diverse neighborhoods, those who report having frequent contact with people in their neighborhood are considerably more trusting of people in general than those who have little or no interpersonal contact. Though this shows that the research in this area is not quite settled, there is enough evidence to say that ethnic and cultural diversity often leads to a decrease of societal trust and of social cohesion, and is thus damaging the social fabric. This video was about people who accept the fact of the Great Replacement, and at the same time welcome it. We tried to confront the arguments of these people with reality. Though we are aware that cultural and ethnic diversity, in moderate doses, has not only disadvantages but also many advantages, here we focused on their negative consequences, as a counterbalance to the mainstream leftist narrative. What are, once more, the arguments in support of this leftist narrative? For many leftists, their main argument is not much more than the idea that the Great Replacement will make Europe more diverse, replacing large segments of the original population with foreigners. They seem to have an almost childish fetish for such diversity. For them it seems to be a good thing, not requiring any further justification. In contrast, some established leftist political parties have more tangible reasons to promote increased diversity. They expect to increase their voter base by increasing the share of the immigrant population. A larger voter base gives them more power and more chance to change society, in accordance with their culturally Marxist, intersectional agenda. Events in the first half of 2020, the year when this video was made, should be a warning for these leftist ideologues. The Black Lives Matter-inspired riots and lootings in America and in Europe, the demolition and defacing of historical statues and monuments, the hysterical racism accusations directed at the police and at white people in general, the groveling by white American and European appeasers, all this, and much more, is the result of growing tensions in multicultural, multi-ethnic societies. These are the kind of societies that European countries are turning fast into, as a consequence of mass immigration. Many leftist ideologues don't see these events as a warning. On the contrary, their ideas provide fuel for the Black Lives Matter demonstrations and riots. They see racism against black people as the greatest evil of our time, and white people as the perpetrators of this evil. The more moderate among them try to solve this problem by driving this racism out of white people in white fragility training courses, which are now burgeoning at American companies. Other leftists are more radical. They actively and enthusiastically participate in the riots. One gains the impression that one of their main motives is an increasingly open Marxist disdain for their own culture and country, which they see as institutionally racist and oppressive. In accordance with their intersectional ideology, they see whites, in particular white men, at the top of the oppression hierarchy. From here it's only a short distance to despising white people in general, as a group. Thus, it's not surprising that the diversity-praising, anti-racist leftists, many of whom are whites, are quickly morphing into radical racist demagogues, with the hated, privileged white people as their target. They see whites as inherently racist. Leftist university professors express their hatred of whites, declare that white lives don't matter, and advocate for abolishing the white race. Their employers, some of which are elite universities, refuse to take any disciplinary measures against them, in effect condoning such views. One wonders how quickly these professors would lose their jobs if they had expressed similar sentiments against black people. And, of course, they deny being racist. They invent new definitions of racism which exclude so-called reverse racism, racism against whites. Thus, while some leftists promote mass immigration for the sake of diversity or to gain votes for their political parties, the more radicals among them want to get rid of white people, because they see them as the source of the worst evil in the world. Replacing whites by people from Africa, the Middle East, and other parts of the Third World seems like the only real solution. These immigrants are never accused of being racist. In fact, they are sometimes assumed to be incapable of racism. If these leftist ideologues think like that, they are mistaken. As shown by Tattoo von Harnen, mentioned previously in this video, severe ethnic conflicts exist in many countries in the world, many of which have no white populations at all. In the shadow of the explosive conflict between whites and blacks in America, we see tensions growing between different peoples of color. There are tensions between American Indian tribes and descendants of former black slaves owned by members of those tribes. These black slaves were among the last ones emancipated after the Civil War. They became tribal citizens, but eventually, during the 20th century, their citizenship was revoked by the tribes. Now some of these descendants of slaves are suing to recover their tribal citizenship. Claude Cox, principal chief of the Creek Indian Nation, expressed the reason for opposing this: fear of being outnumbered. This reason is strikingly similar to that which European identitarians cite to oppose mass immigration. The accusations of racism, directed at the Indians, are also similar to what European opponents of the Great Replacement routinely receive. American citizens of Japanese ancestry living in Hawaii are sometimes called settlers of color by native Hawaiians, in effect accusing them of participating in the oppression of native Hawaiians. The same term is used for black and brown people in Canada. Brown immigrants in the USA are also caught up in the wave of race-based accusations. Thus, in addition to the white fragility training sessions at American companies, there is now talk of brown fragility, sowing the seeds of resentment between brown and black people. It seems that the decline of America's hated white population, speeding up since the 1960s, will hardly result in the harmonious, non-racist society that many on the left dream of. On the contrary, Europe is now well on its way to become similarly multicultural and multi-ethnic as the United States is. A small recent example of the coming conflicts between non-European ethnic groups living in Europe was provided in June 2020, in Vienna, Austria. A Kurdish demonstration, supported by Antifa activists, against the policies of Turkish President Erdogan was attacked by nationalistic Turks belonging to the Grey Wolves movement. The hand sign shown on the photo by Turks is the wolf salutation of the Grey Wolves, forbidden to show in Austria since 2019. Demonstrations, counter-demonstrations and riots lasting several days ensued. The Turks attacked the house serving as a kind of headquarters of the Antifa, too. Several people were hurt and others were arrested by the police. There were also mutual accusations at the diplomatic level between Austria and Turkey. Welcome to the multicultural, multi-ethnic utopia.